Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. My name's Andy Robinson and you join us at the start of a new series. Over the years on the podcast, we've heard from different people talking about their experiences of sexuality, and we've got a new series looking at more stories that we've not covered before. And I'm delighted to be joined by Ashley for this episode. So Ashley, given that we're going to look at stories over the next few weeks, I want you to imagine you get the chance to write your autobiography. What's the title? What's the main thing you want to say about yourself?
Well, that's a dangerous question. I feel like it should relate to Jesus, shouldn't it? But realistically, I think the word bibliomaniac would probably be somewhere in the title of my autobiography, which is someone who has a slightly obsessive compulsion to read books. And that would, I'm not sure what the full title would be, but that would definitely be in there.
Okay, I'm trying to work out whether a book with the title Bibliomaniac would sell well. I suspect, actually, it will attract other people who are mad on reading books. And maybe
absolutely.
It would.
I'd pick up a book with that in the title.
There is a definite market there for your autobiography, which I'm eagerly looking forward to. I ended up with, I couldn't work out whether I wanted to be flippant or serious. So if I were going to be flippant, it would be the sort of Northern Exile story. So I think it would be There Is No R in Bath, I think would be my autobiography title. If I were being more serious, I don't know, there's a verse in Psalm 103 that I've always loved. He does not treat us as our sins deserve. And so, I don't know, better than my sins deserve, I guess, is sort of the story of my life. So I don't know which one would sell better, actually. There Is No R in Bath,
No.
Better Than My Sins Deserve, or Bibliomaniac. So if people sort of want us to write these, just email the Living Out office. Anyway, enough of us. We're really pleased to have Simon with us today. Simon, do you want to tell us a little bit about where you are at the moment, a little bit about who you are and what you do? That'd be great.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's great to join you guys on the podcast. I'm a minister in Sydney, Australia. So we're recording this at opposite ends of a day across the time zones. So I've just started at the start of this year working as an Anglican minister in Sydney. I got ordained in February. Spent the previous few years studying at Moore Theological College, which is also in Sydney. So I've done a bunch of studying for that, and so now I'm working as an assistant minister at a church in the Inner West, which has been great. It's been lovely after spending so much time studying to actually be doing the thing I've been studying to do. Which has been really fun. So I work there, particularly looking after kids ministry, which is really fun. I come from like a design and creative background, so there's lots of opportunities to do lots of fun creative things in kids ministry, so that's great. So I do that part-time. I also spend a day a week working for Single Minded, which is an organization that's kind of helping to think about singleness and how to think about that in the church. And I also am spending a day a week doing some work for an organisation called Living Faith, which is a little bit like the equivalent of Living Out in the UK for Sydney. So I'm working on a resource for them at the moment. So I split my time between a few different hats, but it's quite fun. Life's never dull when you're doing all those different things. And I think also from the creative background, I'm used to loads of projects on the go. So I kind of like having a few things in the air all at once. I find that quite fun. We'll see. Maybe in a year and a half's time, I'll find it more draining than fun. But at the moment, I'm really enjoying it.
Good stuff. We're really pleased to have you with us, Simon.
So Simon, we're going to ask you all about your story. And let's start with how you became a Christian. What's your story there?
Yeah, I feel like I can't really say I had a day without knowing Jesus as Lord, which is a wonderful privilege. My grandfather was a minister, and I grew up in the church, and so really can't pinpoint a place where my faith didn't mean something to me in my life. So I think it's definitely been more of a progressive journey of growth and understanding over time. So, I think I remember even when I was super young, like in year 2 here, I just have vivid memories of praying to Jesus like he was a real close friend. And that's a beautiful thing. I wish I kind of prayed in the same way that I did of that memory now. It was just such a lovely memory that I weirdly have. So I really can't say I've ever had a day without knowing Jesus as Lord. But I think, in my latter teen years, there was definitely a period of time with kind of figuring out who I am and what it looks like for me as a Christian. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more later. That did push a little bit of distance between me and church. I found church really hard and isolating. And so there was definitely a period in my late teen years when I was just finishing up with school that, faith was a bit more of a struggle to figure out. But then in my uni days, I got connected with a really amazing Christian group that was kind of for people who were studying creative things on uni campuses. And I just found Christians who loved the arts and creativity, and who loved Jesus. And that was just really exciting because I hadn't really experienced that before. And I remember on the first intro night for this Christian uni group, they talked about the passage in Luke where Jesus talks about giving to Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God's. And they made the point that we are made in God's image. We're stamped with his image. And so we should be giving everything to him because we are his. And it just struck me on that night that I was not doing that. And I kind of decided that I actually should be doing that and really wanted to do that. And so that was kind of a real significant moment that reaffirmed my belief and my decision to follow Jesus. There's been lots of ebbs and flows on the journey since, but that's what my story is in that way.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that, Simon. I guess those later teen years, some of that struggle might have been around sexuality. So I know that, like Andy and I, you experience same-sex attraction. It's the Living Out podcast. That's not going to be a surprise.
Yeah,
I guess when did you realise that you were same-sex attracted, and was that a part of your struggles in terms of your faith?
Yeah, so that was kind of early mid-teen years, kind of through puberty, which, I think is confusing for everyone. So part of me thought it was just a confusing thing that everyone went through in the same way. But there was a sense of realizing that actually maybe there was things that were slightly different. And I think, it took me a long time to realize what was happening, and that I was same-sex attracted. There was a process of understanding what was going on in myself, and trying to understand what that was, especially, even in the 90s. I was born in the early 90s, and so even in that time I feel like it was less of a big thing that was talked about that much, so I didn't quite have the same scaffold that probably someone nowadays growing up would have. So I was kind of struggling to understand these things, and then also struggling to figure out how that related to faith. It took me a while to kind of admit things to myself in my own head, and then even admitting things to God in prayer kind of felt like this huge step that kind of made it feel more real. I think there were definitely times where I thought, oh, maybe this is just a thing in my head, it's not really real, or like I've made it up or whatever. But it's kind of a journey of understanding that was, that this was a thing that was a part of me, and that it wasn't changing as much as I had hoped that it would. It wasn't a phase I was going through. And so, it was those early teen years, but, a long journey of understanding what that looked like for me that followed that.
How did you find, I guess once you'd come to terms with that a bit more yourself, and maybe a bit more with God, although I don't know if that was around the same sort of time, how did you find also sharing that with other people? Was that something that kind of flowed naturally from you accepting it for yourself, or has that been something more difficult for you?
Yeah, that was definitely something on the more difficult end. I think there were definitely parts of time where I thought that this would probably just be something that I kept to myself and was a thing between me and God, and I wouldn't be sharing with anyone else. Yeah, that was quite a long time, like about 10 years, where I thought, this is just my own thing that I'm not going to be sharing with anyone, which is a long time to have not told anyone that. It really just became this huge part of my thought life that I just couldn't express with anyone else. And that's quite isolating to kind of have this thing that feels so significant internally, and have no way of discussing or processing that with people. So yeah, I think I found friendships and relationships quite hard because of that. I'd want to put a barrier in levels of intimacy. I'd be concerned about how I was acting that would maybe give something away. Yeah, really things that kind of put in the way of me being known. And so, yeah, it wasn't really a thing I was planning to do, except this time that a friend dropped a letter in my letterbox and shared their own experiences with same-sex attraction. And I just remember just feeling so freaked out because I didn't know what to do. No one shared anything like this with me before. I didn't know how to react or what to say. And in the end, I remember I just agonized over it for ages, and I just sent him a text that said, so do I. And that was kind of the first time I decided to share it with someone. So I'm very thankful for his honesty and the way that kind of helped at least crack that door open in sharing it with people. I think even for a long time after that, it was a very tight group of people that I shared it with. I didn't really want to talk about it very publicly, and I didn't really have that many people I trusted that much to share it with at that point. You know, it was a freaky thing to share that with people in the early days. And I definitely followed my friend's suit and wrote letters to people the first few times, just because I thought that was a way I could control what I was saying. And I remember even writing in the letters, this is how you can respond that is helpful. This is what I would like you to do, just because I wanted to remove the burden as much as I could. So, yeah, I cringe a little bit thinking about those early days. Yeah, but I'm really glad that kind of happened over that period of time, and there were some real precious friendships that were really deepened through sharing it with those people, that I'm so thankful for in that time. Yeah.
Has anything... I mean, you're now obviously sharing on a podcast that's just going to publicly on the internet.
Yeah.
I guess, were there things that your friends did that helped you to feel more comfortable? Like, how have you got to the point where you're so willing to share openly now?
That's a great question. And, you know, even 5 years ago, me would be freaking out at the thought of doing a podcast like this. But I think, you know, the major one is just listening. Friends who just were willing to sit and listen as I kind of process things. I feel like sometimes I think I went through my teenage years in my early 20s when I had all this angst that I haven't ever shared with people, that I then started sharing with people, and I was so angsty about it. And like I had one lovely friend who we'd kind of have dinner together, but I didn't want to talk about this stuff over dinner in a public place, so we'd kind of save those chats for the car on the way home. And he spent a lot of time just sitting in the car listening to me talk about these things. And so that patient listening, I think, was a big deal. My minister at the time I shared these things with when I was going through a particularly hard time. And so he was really helpful in kind of both listening, but then also helping me think about these things theologically, to kind of have more of a framework around these things. So, you know, having friends to walk alongside, and a minister to kind of help me think about these things, certainly helped me progress being more comfortable talking about these things, and more okay with sharing them, and being less stressed with, I don't know, how other people might take it, and more confident just in myself to share these things. And maybe also realizing that sharing these things is helpful for other people, because I've benefited from people who have shared in the past. So, yeah, there's a helpfulness that I'm aware of there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been helpful for me just listening to you for the last few minutes. It's really encouraging to hear. So thank you for your honesty. I've got to ask as well, obviously you're in Sydney. I've never been to Sydney. This may be a difficult thing to answer, but I'll ask and we'll see. What is it like being a same-sex attracted Christian in Sydney? Do you think it's different to our experience in the UK?
Yeah, it's a great question. In some ways it is a little bit hard because this is the waters I swim in, and I've only been to the UK once in my life, so although I do feel like there's a lot of cultural similarities, particularly with Christianity that's going on between our countries. So I think there's a lot of things that would be quite similar. Although, you know, in Sydney, we've got this really core, solid evangelical Anglican denomination who really care about, what the Bible says about this issue and how to live faithfully about these things. And so there's a sense that that's a really strong part of the Sydney Christian evangelical sphere. But I guess on the flip side, Sydney is also really famous as a very LGBTQ friendly city. We kind of have the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras that happen in February every year, and that's kind of an increasingly bigger and bigger deal over time. World Pride was here, I think, last year. And so they're kind of quite famously gay friendly and very gay positive and all of those things. And so there is a bit of a weird juxtaposition of quite a significant denomination that still holds to these biblical truths, but in a city that is pretty significantly positive and pro gay marriage and all of those sorts of things. And so that really kind of came out a few years ago when we had this gay marriage debate about legalizing gay marriage. And so you really notice that tension between people who believed in this theological ethic of what marriage is and should look like, and then in a society where people were very pro-gay marriage, there was a real sense of tension in that moment for me, because I think I felt the way that some people were conducting this debate was really unhelpful on both sides, and so sometimes I felt like I was a bit in a no man's land of sympathizing with how difficult gay people have found this and how personally they've taken it, but then also really believing strongly that marriage is what God says it is, if you're a Christian. And so, I felt a bit isolated from Christians who were graceless in talking about this. And so that was a really hard tension. And I think that still kind of plays in the air a little bit, that, we are really juxtaposed in Sydney, I guess, in these things.
You're listening to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. For more stories, resources and events, visit our website at livingout.org.
What we're trying to do in this series is hear stories and then pick up particular aspects of each story, because there's variety in all of them. And so Simon is keen to talk through particularly same-sex attraction and ministry with you, because funnily enough, that's a story we share. I was a church leader for 19 years whilst experiencing same-sex attraction. So just want to dig into that a little bit. How's it been for you? How have you reconciled sexuality as you've been heading towards church ministry?
It's been a complicated question, and I think, as I realized these things about myself and was wrestling with my sexuality, I think I had some sort of instinctual thought that just discounted ministry for me in any way. And so I sort of just hadn't even thought about it. I thought it was off the cards because of my sexuality. And so for a long period of time, I just thought it wasn't something I was going to do. It's something I would be involved in any way. I got really involved in my uni Christian group, and that was great. I got more and more involved in the church, but still thinking I'd be a member of a church and, willing to be dedicated to that, but not really thinking about ministry as something that I would do. And so I think that only really started to change as I realized that there were people who were in ministry who were open about dealing with same-sex attraction. So, Sam Albury and Vaughan Roberts, when I heard about them, it was quite a striking moment for me, because I went, oh, hang on, they're in ministry and they're open about these things. I guess that means it could be okay for me. And so that was just an initial, maybe this is a wrong dichotomy that I've created in my head. But it was still a long time before I even thought about going into ministry. I was very keen to work in something creative. I did a Bachelor of Design. And so that was just always my life, and I'd never thought about going into ministry. But as I started working for myself for a little while and got really involved in church, and just the question started looming more and more that I should think about ministry. And that really scared me, because I still didn't quite know what that looked like for being same-sex attracted and in ministry. I didn't feel ready to be public about that at the time when I was thinking about these things, but I think I was aware that I'd want to be really thoughtful going in. and be really confident in my position and my understanding before thinking about committing to ministry. And so there were a lot of discussions with friends and people about what that might look like, and my minister was really helpful in talking those things through. And so I realized that actually there's a real benefit to being same-sex attracted and going into ministry. Like there could be good things about this. In my head, I just thought it was this huge problem to deal with. But I think over time I realized that actually this could be a real positive and a real blessing. There's very few people in my local circles who are open about same-sex attraction and in ministry. So I still feel like a little bit of an anomaly, at least in Sydney. But I think that means that there's an opportunity for me to say, hey, this is not something that's disqualified me from ministry, and actually that I believe what the Bible says is good, and I'm willing to not only believe it myself, but teach others and encourage them to believe that too. And so I've come to think that actually it can be a real plus being in ministry, which is quite a turnaround from where I was a little while ago.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely to hear. Fully, if there are so many things I can empathise with here, my story is very similar to that, and was in pastoral ministry for about 10 or 11 years before talking to the church about it. But how have you found that? Because you mentioned earlier on that when there was the vote on gay marriage, it felt hard culturally, and it felt at times a little bit hard in the church. What's been your experience of that as you've done ministry?
I mean, my experience of sharing more publicly has been incredibly positive from Christians, which I think, as I was thinking through whether I would share more publicly about things or not, I kind of was aware that some people might not like that, and there'd be some people who would be grumpy about me being in ministry in this position. And so, I was mentally gearing up for it being that there would be some positives, but there'd be some really negative pushback as well. But really, I was a little bit overwhelmed by how positive people have been in me sharing my journey and talking more publicly about sexuality and faith. It's been a really positive thing from other people. I think that's felt a bit weird for me to kind of share this thing that's been complex and there's a lot of shame and other things going on, to then have people say how glad they are that I've been talking about this felt a little weird, and kind of took me a while to kind of figure out and get back to equilibrium, especially when I was gearing up for a negative reaction. It being so positive, I was kind of like, okay. So it's been actually really positive thus far. I mean, I'm sure at some point there will be negative things that will happen, because that's what happens, but so far it's been really positive. People have been really encouraging about me sharing these things, and it really opens up a space for deeper conversations. I think it's been beautiful in friendships because you bring a sense of intimacy, but it's actually been a thing for deeper conversations even with people I don't know very well, who have spoken to me about things and come up to me after church or all those sorts of things. It's a real privilege that it has opened up the conversation in a different way.
I think the interesting thing both about sexuality and about ministry as well is it can throw in a whole load of confusion about identity, in terms of so often sexuality can be identity. Actually, funnily enough, ministry can become a key identity marker, and our whole sense of self-worth goes up and down depending on how ministry is going. Have both sexuality and ministry helped you to reflect a little bit around the theme of identity?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. It's something that culturally we talk about a lot. It just seems everywhere at the moment, identity language. And it's something that I feel, I've kind of ebbed and flowed in understanding and thinking. I feel like there were times where it felt like sexuality was the main thing about me that I could think about and was everything, and where faith was everything. And so I kind of would have these swings and moments where it would feel really different or be really difficult, or things would change. And so part of my time at Moore College, I really wanted to understand this a little bit better and actually think about these things from a biblical and Christian perspective. Because I think sometimes we can kind of take these cultural narratives and then just apply them to Christian things, and rather taking what the Bible says and applying it to cultural narratives. And so I kind of had become a little bit frustrated and at least unconvinced by the common line that I seem to find everywhere was find your identity in Christ, which was so often used to negate other experiences or other aspects of who I am, rather than kind of build something positive or bring things together. So I spent a year last year kind of researching this idea, did like a kind of a sort of an honors thesis, I guess, in my final year at Bible college, researching these things, largely just for myself to kind of go out in the world and have a greater sense of confidence in how to interact with all these different messages that I'm hearing from the world and from church and other people, but to have a stable sense of who I am that kind of sits over those things was something that I really wanted to understand better, so that I didn't place too much pressure on one thing, but also that gave me space to kind of be me and figure out who I am and how I fit in the world, in a way that's not idolizing the self, but just understanding myself. So I spent a lot of time thinking about those things. It became a joke in my year at college. Whenever identity would come up, people would like text me or look at me or give me a nudge. And identity comes up a lot, so it was pretty frequent. But that's been a great journey that I've found really helpful thinking about these things.
Can I ask, did you come to any conclusions at the end of your year, if you were trying to summarize where you landed? Any thoughts?
The catchword is it's a little bit more complex than maybe we think, which is hard for a summary answer. But I think we kind of are confused about anthropology. We don't quite know who we are as people. And I think that plays a lot into the identity thing, because, culturally we're confused about what it means to be human. But I think in the church we can be confused about it as well. And so really understanding how God has made us, and so looking to Jesus is always helpful in everything, but I think particularly in anthropology, because you kind of see what a sinless human was like. And so you can kind of understand how God has created us to be by looking at Jesus. And so seeing the ways that he was a unique person, he had personality, he grew over time, and he remains human now. So Hebrews has been great in that. And so just finding that space to be a little bit more, and be okay with that. I think being known by God's significant too. Something that was really big was Augustine's Confessions. And what's really significant in that is that God sees and understands him completely. Yeah. And so that just brings a greater sense of freedom, I think, knowing that God sees and understands us in a way that we can never fully understand. And so there's just so much more freedom to kind of, for things to change about who you are and your circumstance, and no one thing hold all the weight of who you are, because kind of God holds you together. And so that has been a really helpful thing. That's not a concise answer. It's a little bit complex.
Don't worry at all. Well, I know you write on Substacks, and we'll put the link to that in the show notes. So if people want to explore your thoughts more on that, glad that those thoughts are available. But let me take you back to your experience of being in ministry and the church being aware of that. You said that was largely a positive experience. What kind of things did the church do well that means that's been an encouragement for you?
It was a little bit of a weird time when I did share more publicly, because I was a student minister, so I was only at church one day a week, and I shared at a point where I was about to start at a new church, so I was kind of in a little bit of church limbo, which was slightly intentional of why I shared at that point. It became a little bit hard to figure out how to deal with sharing at the church I was at when I was finishing up and we were saying farewell. It was a bit hard to go, oh, by the way, here's this other huge thing. I decided to do it in between churches. But I think, from the few churches that I've been at and worked at over the last little while, I got a lot of really encouraging messages from people that were really lovely and supportive. And that still has happened. I was talking to someone from my home church just recently, and he was saying how he felt so proud to know me when he read that message. And that was really lovely for him to say that. So people have been really encouraging. I think, people just being present and willing to listen is always helpful and good. And I think, church can be complicated and messy sometimes, and that's okay, especially when you're at 3 different churches over this period of 5 years. You don't necessarily have the same level of depth as I'm hoping will happen now that I'm in a church and will be sticking around for a little while. So, yeah, it can be a little bit hard. My situation's a little bit weird, being at Bible college and moving around. But I think, people just the light touch message of, I really appreciated that from them. And then just kind of going on with life has been great. Yeah.
No, it's funny. I remember when I shared with the church that I pastored for 10 years, and I think expected it to be sort of awkward and silent, and let's just pretend that hasn't happened. As it happened, I got emails from about 3/4 of the church, actually, and I just still find that really moving. And I think most of us who've gone through that process, by and large, have actually found the church to be way more positive than we'd anticipated and expected. And sometimes the church gets a sort of bad rap, as it were, for handling sexuality issues. And funnily enough, for most of my friends, as we talk about this, we've found the church to be supportive, welcoming, helpful. The odd individual not quite knowing what to say, which you understand, but overall it's been positive, and I'm thrilled that's been your experience as well, Simon. Let me take you back just with a final question. If you could say anything to your younger self as you were just wrestling with this as a teenager, any things you would want to say?
I think in some ways, some of the things that I've learned over the time are the things that I'd like to remind myself of, just be patient with yourself, don't try and rush into things, and don't, beat yourself up for taking your time to figure out these things and for figuring out how to share things with people. So I think being patient has been a big thing that I've learned over time that I think I'd love to tell my younger self. And I think also just, I think in that patience, being patient with relationships as well. I think I kind of wanted those early friendships to kind of fix all these problems for me, and I placed a lot of pressure on some of them. And so kind of that patience also with others in going, these relationships will develop. It's okay. It is new and exciting to share these things with people, and that's great. But, build it over time. Be patient with these people as well. Don't expect them to answer all your problems and fill all those gaps that you've felt for so long. So, patience with yourself and others, and trusting God that God is in control and he has got it. I tend to think things are going to be terrible before they happen, and that they're going to be a disaster, and I go, okay, well, God, you can look after it, but I think it's going to be terrible. And then things often, most of the time, turn out much better than I expected. And so I think trusting God that things will probably be better than you think you are, that they will be, is probably another thing I'd like to say to myself.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you so much, Simon. It's been lovely to hear your story and see the way the Lord has been at work. I hope that's been encouraging for all of us who've been listening to it. I say, do check out Simon's material at Substack, details in the show notes. Do join us for the rest of the series. One of the things we often end up saying is that all our stories are different. If you've heard one same-sex attracted story, you've heard one same-sex attracted story. And so as we go through the series, I'm excited at the opportunity to pick up different emphases from different people. So please do join us. The next one will be out in a fortnight's time. In the meantime, thanks so much for listening.